December 18, 1944, the Ardennes forest. Snow fell in silence over the broken stones of a Belgian farmhouse. Inside, crouched beneath a collapsed timber beam, a young American combat engineer named Corporal James Hendricks pressed his frozen hands against his rifle and listened. The sound came first as a distant rumble, then as a growl, then as the unmistakable metallic grinding of steel treads, chewing through ice and earth. Somewhere beyond the tree line, hidden in the fog and falling snow, a German Tiger tank was moving toward his position. Hendricks had no bazooka, no anti-tank mine, no artillery support. What he did have, coiled in his pack like a sleeping serpent, was 60 feet of communications wire and an idea so simple it seemed insane. In the next 8 minutes, that wire would do what American shells had failed to do for 3 years. It would stop the most feared weapon in Hitler's arsenal, and it would change the way the United States Army understood the quiet, unassuming power of field ingenuity forever. This is not a story about firepower. It is a story about desperation meeting creativity in the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge. It is about one man, one moment, and one improvised trick that turned the myth of German invincibility into smoking wreckage on a forest road. What happens next will show you why the greatest weapon in war is not always the one that makes the loudest noise. Stay with this, because by the end, you will understand how America won the war, not just with tanks and bombs, but with the kind of raw, stubborn cleverness that no military academy could ever teach. The Tiger tank was a nightmare made real. 56 tons of Krupp steel, an 88mm gun that could punch through American Sherman armor from over a mile away, frontal armor nearly 4 inches thick. When the first Tigers rolled into combat in Tunisia in 1942, they shattered Allied confidence. British tank crews called them the Beast. American GIs called them worse. A single Tiger could hold a road against a dozen Shermans. In the bocage of Normandy, in the streets of Caen, in the forests of the Hurtgen, the Tiger became a symbol of German engineering superiority and a psychological weapon as effective as its cannon. To face a Tiger was to face your own mortality. To destroy one required luck, numbers, and more courage than most men could summon. By December 1944, the Third Reich was bleeding. The Allies had liberated France. Soviet forces were closing in from the east. But Adolf Hitler had one last gamble. Operation Wacht am Rhein. The plan was audacious and desperate. Launch a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes, split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western powers to negotiate a separate peace. Hitler committed his best remaining divisions. He committed his dwindling fuel reserves. And he committed his remaining Tigers. For 2 weeks in December, the ghost of German military power roared back to life in the snow-covered hills of Belgium and Luxembourg. American units were overrun. Entire regiments were surrounded. The world watched and wondered if the tide was turning again. Corporal James Hendricks was 23 years old. He was from a place called Terre Haute, Indiana. Before the war, he had worked as an apprentice electrician for the local power company. He knew how to string wire, how to splice connections, how to troubleshoot circuits in freezing rain and summer heat. The skills were mundane, the kind of trade knowledge that seemed useless in the face of panzer divisions and artillery barrages. But the Army had made him a combat engineer. And combat engineers were taught to think in ways infantrymen were not. They understood leverage. They understood materials. They understood that sometimes the answer to a problem was not brute force, but precise application of physics and timing. On the morning of December 18th, Hendricks and his squad were attached to a mixed company of infantry and tank destroyers holding a crossroads south of Malmedy. The position was critical. If the Germans broke through, they would have a clear road to the Meuse River. But the American line was thin, exhausted, low on ammunition. And then the forward observer radioed the words every man dreaded. Tiger. Moving south along the forest road. ETA 6 minutes. The company had 2 M10 tank destroyers. Good machines. But their 76mm guns could only penetrate a Tiger from the rear or flanks. Head on, they were outmatched. The captain knew it. He ordered the M10s to pull back and set up an ambush position where the road curved. But the road did not curve for another half-mile, and the Tiger was closing fast. Hendricks watched the infantry dig in behind fallen logs and frozen dirt. He watched them check their rifles and fix bayonets. He watched them accept what was coming. And something in his electrician's mind clicked. He turned to his squad leader, asked for permission to try something. The sergeant looked at him like he was insane, but there was no time to argue. Hendricks grabbed his spool of comms wire, grabbed a private named Kowalski, and ran toward the road. The plan was absurd in its simplicity. Hendricks had seen it in his mind the moment the Tiger was reported. Tank treads move in a continuous loop. The drive sprocket at the rear pulls the track forward. The idler wheel at the front guides it. If something gets caught between the track and the wheels, the system jams. In civilian vehicles, this was a maintenance nuisance. In a 56-ton war machine moving at 15 miles per hour, it could be catastrophic. Hendricks knew wire. He knew tension. He knew that steel cable under the right load could act like a saw or a trap. The question was whether he could get it in position before the Tiger arrived. The road was narrow, hemmed in by dense pine forest on both sides. Hendricks and Kowalski sprinted through knee-deep snow to a point where two thick trees stood roughly 20 feet apart, flanking the road. Hendricks tied one end of the wire to the base of the left tree, played out the spool, crossed the road at a dead run, wrapped the wire twice around the right tree, and pulled it taut at a height of exactly 14 inches. The wire was thin, dark green, nearly invisible against the snow and shadow. Hendricks twisted the end into a figure-8 knot, secured it with a metal tent stake driven into frozen ground. Then he and Kowalski ran back to the tree line and dropped into a shell crater. 60 seconds later, the Tiger appeared. It came through the fog like a rolling fortress, black crosses painted on the turret, exhaust smoke billowing from the rear deck. The commander's hatch was open. A German officer in a field gray coat scanned the road ahead through binoculars. The tank moved at a steady pace, confident, unstoppable. Hendricks held his breath. The wire was invisible. He was certain of that. But would it hold? Would it catch? Or would it simply snap like thread under the weight of the advancing steel? The Tiger's left track hit the wire first. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the wire went taut. The tree on the left side of the road groaned. The wire dug into the frozen rubber pads of the track. And then, with a sound like a gunshot, the wire caught in the gap between the track and the drive sprocket. The tank lurched. The driver gunned the engine. The wire pulled tighter. And then the entire left track assembly seized. The Tiger slewed violently to the left. The right track kept moving. The left track stopped dead. 56 tons of momentum swung the tank's nose into the tree line. The driver tried to reverse. The engine roared. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. But the wire had wound itself into the sprocket mechanism like a python. The more the driver gunned the engine, the tighter it pulled. Metal shrieked. The track began to separate from the road wheels. And then, with a final grinding crack, the left track snapped. The Tiger was immobilized. The German commander threw open his hatch and shouted orders. The crew began to bail out. But the American infantry was already moving. Rifle fire cracked through the trees. A bazooka team sprinted forward and put 2 rockets into the Tiger's exposed rear armor. The fuel tanks ignited. Flame roared from the engine deck. The crew that made it out were cut down or captured within seconds. The tank that had terrorized a generation of Allied soldiers sat burning in the snow, defeated not by a bigger gun or a faster tank, but by 60 feet of wire and the quick thinking of an electrician from Indiana. Word of Hendricks's trick spread through the division like wildfire. Within days, combat engineer units across the Ardennes front were carrying spools of wire specifically for anti-tank traps. The tactic was not always successful. It required the right terrain, the right timing, the right kind of luck. But when it worked spectacularly. A captured German tank commander, interrogated after the Battle of the Bulge, expressed disbelief when told how his Tiger had been stopped. He called it unsporting, a violation of the rules of armored warfare. The American interrogator smiled and told him there were no rules, only results. But the significance of Hendricks's wire trap went deeper than tactical innovation. It represented something fundamental about the American way of war. The German military excelled at engineering, at precision, at manufacturing weapons of overwhelming power. The Tiger tank was a masterpiece of design, but it was also a product of rigid thinking. German tank doctrine emphasized frontal assault, superior armor, superior firepower. When those advantages were negated, German crews often found themselves without answers. The Americans, by contrast, had built their military culture on adaptability, on improvisation, on the understanding that the man in the field, not the general in the headquarters, was often best positioned to solve the immediate problem. This philosophy was born from the American industrial experience. The United States in the 1940s was a nation of tinkerers, farmers who repaired their own tractors, factory workers who understood assembly lines, electricians and plumbers and mechanics who solved problems with tools and creativity rather than doctrine. When these men were handed rifles and sent to Europe, they brought that mindset with them. They did not wait for orders when orders made no sense. They did not accept defeat when a solution was possible. They saw the battlefield as a problem to be solved, and they solved it with whatever materials were at hand. The wire trick was not taught at West Point. It was not in any field manual. It was the product of one man's specific knowledge, applied to one desperate moment. But it was also emblematic of a larger truth. The American soldier was not the best trained soldier in the world. He was not the most disciplined, but he was perhaps the most resourceful. And in a war of attrition and adaptation, resourcefulness was the ultimate force multiplier. The German soldiers who faced the Americans in the winter of 1944 had expected something different. They had been told that the Americans were soft, that they relied on material abundance but lacked fighting spirit, that when faced with real hardship, they would crumble. This narrative was central to Nazi propaganda. It was echoed in the words of German officers and in the pages of Wehrmacht training manuals. The American soldier, they said, was a product of a decadent democracy. He fought for money and comfort, not for blood and soil. He would break when the going got hard. The Battle of the Bulge shattered that myth. The American units trapped in Bastogne refused to surrender. The engineers at the Meuse River bridges held their positions under relentless attack, and men like Hendricks, faced with impossible odds, found ways to win. What the Germans had mistaken for softness was actually flexibility. What they had mistaken for lack of discipline was actually initiative. The American soldier did not need a commissar or an ideology to keep him fighting. He fought because he believed in going home, and he would use every trick, every tool, and every ounce of ingenuity to make that happen. The Tiger tank had been designed to inspire fear, and it did. But fear, the Americans learned, could be overcome with knowledge, with preparation, with the stubborn refusal to accept that a machine, no matter how powerful, was unbeatable. Hendricks did not destroy the Tiger through heroism in the traditional sense. He destroyed it through understanding. He looked at the problem. He identified the weak point, and he exploited it with the tools he had. It was war as problem-solving, and in that approach lay the seeds of American victory. After the war, Corporal James Hendricks returned to Terre Haute. He went back to work for the power company. He married a woman named Dorothy. He raised 3 children. He never spoke much about what he had done in Belgium. When people asked about his service, he said he had been an engineer, that he had strung wire and cleared roads. The story of the Tiger tank became a footnote in his life, a moment of terror and inspiration that faded into the quiet rhythms of peacetime. But the wire trick did not fade from military memory. It was documented in after-action reports. It was analyzed by Army historians. It was taught, in modified form, to engineer units in Korea and Vietnam. The principle was simple but profound. Asymmetric warfare did not require asymmetric weapons. It required asymmetric thinking. A man with the right knowledge and the right moment could achieve what a battalion with the wrong tools could not. The wire itself became a kind of symbol, not of violence, but of connection. In peacetime, wire carried electricity. It carried voices. It linked homes and cities and nations. In war, it became a weapon. But even as a weapon, it was a tool of precision, of calculation, of the quiet application of force at the exact right point. It was the opposite of the Tiger's 88mm gun. The gun announced itself with thunder and flame. The wire worked in silence, invisible until the moment it mattered. There is a photograph in the National Archives. It shows a burned-out Tiger tank in a snowy forest. The left track is coiled in the dirt like a dead snake. The trees around it are scorched black. In the foreground, barely visible, is a piece of wire still wrapped around the base of a pine tree. The photograph was taken by a Signal Corps cameraman 2 days after the engagement. It is grainy, underexposed, easy to overlook. But if you know what you are looking at, the image tells a complete story. It tells the story of how wars are really won, not always by the loudest explosion or the heaviest armor, but by the quiet ingenuity of men who refused to give up. The Battle of the Bulge lasted 6 weeks. By the time it ended, the German offensive had been crushed. The Wehrmacht had lost men and machines it could not replace. The road to the Rhine was open, and the myth of the Tiger tank as an unstoppable weapon had been broken in 100 small engagements across the frozen forests of Belgium. Some were broken by superior numbers, some by air support, some by flanking maneuvers, and at least one was broken by a spool of wire, and the quick thinking of a man who understood that every machine, no matter how fearsome, had a weak point. What does it mean to stop a Tiger tank with wire? It means understanding that war is not a contest of pure strength. It is a contest of adaptation. The side that learns faster, improvises better, and refuses to be paralyzed by fear is the side that survives. The Germans built the Tiger to dominate the battlefield through sheer power, and for a time it did. But the Americans built an army that could adapt to any challenge. They built an army of farmers and electricians and factory workers who brought their civilian skills to the battlefield and used them in ways no one had anticipated. Hendricks did not invent a new weapon. He repurposed an old tool. He saw the battlefield not as a static equation of firepower versus armor, but as a dynamic environment where knowledge and creativity could shift the balance. That mindset, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of soldiers, was the true secret weapon of the American military. It was the reason why, despite being outgunned in tank versus tank combat, the Americans won the armored war in Europe. It was the reason why, despite suffering terrible casualties in the Ardennes, they held the line and then pushed forward. The wire trick was a microcosm of that larger truth. One man, one moment, one simple idea executed with precision and courage. It was not glamorous. It was not cinematic in the Hollywood sense. There were no dramatic speeches or slow-motion heroics. There was only a young man from Indiana, crouched in the snow, gambling that physics and desperation could overcome 56 tons of German steel. And when the gamble paid off, it proved something essential about the nature of American resilience. Today, the forests of the Ardennes are quiet. The farmhouses have been rebuilt. The roads are paved and peaceful. Tourists visit the battlefields and walk among the monuments to the soldiers who fought there. The names of the dead are carved in stone. The stories of great battles are told in museums and books. But the small stories, the individual moments of creativity and courage, are harder to preserve. They slip through the cracks of official history. They are lost in the vastness of a war that consumed continents and killed millions. But those small stories matter. They matter because they reveal the human dimension of conflict. They show us that war is not just about grand strategies and overwhelming force. It is about individuals making choices under impossible pressure. It is about the electrician who becomes a tank killer, the clerk who becomes a medic, the farmer who becomes a scout. It is about ordinary people discovering that they are capable of extraordinary things when there is no other choice. James Hendricks's wire trick did not win the Battle of the Bulge. No single action did, but it contributed to the victory. It saved lives. It delayed a German advance. It proved that American soldiers, when pushed to the edge, would find a way to push back. And in the larger narrative of the war, that quality, that refusal to accept defeat, was what separated the Allies from their enemies. The Germans fought with discipline and skill. The Japanese fought with fanaticism and courage. But the Americans fought with a kind of stubborn, inventive optimism that could not be broken. There is a lesson here that extends beyond the battlefield. It is a lesson about the power of knowledge, about the value of practical skills, about the importance of thinking creatively when confronted with problems that seem insurmountable. Hendricks was not a genius. He was not a decorated war hero before that December morning. He was a man with a specific set of skills who found himself in a situation where those skills, applied correctly, made the difference between life and death. How many other soldiers had similar moments? How many battles were won by men who used carpentry skills to build better fortifications? By men who used hunting skills to outmaneuver enemy patrols? By men who used mechanical skills to keep vehicles running when supply lines failed? The official histories focus on generals and grand strategies, but the real history of war is written by the men in the dirt and snow who improvise solutions to immediate problems and keep fighting when every rational calculation says they should retreat. The Tiger tank was a symbol of German engineering. Precise, powerful, built to dominate through superior design. But it was also inflexible. When confronted with an unexpected tactic, it had no answer. The wire trap exploited that inflexibility. It turned the Tiger's own weight and power against it. And in doing so, it demonstrated a fundamental truth about conflict. The most powerful weapon is useless if it cannot adapt to the environment. The most sophisticated machine can be defeated by the simplest tool if that tool is used with intelligence and precision. When the war ended, the surviving Tigers were studied by Allied engineers. Their armor was measured. Their guns were tested. Their engines were disassembled and analyzed. The technical reports filled volumes. But the most important lesson about the Tiger was not found in those reports. It was found in the field, in the mud and snow of France and Belgium and Germany, where American soldiers learned that the Tiger could be beaten. Not with better tanks, not always with bigger guns, but with courage and creativity, and the willingness to try something that had never been tried before. Hendrix's wire was one of those experiments. It worked once, maybe twice. It was not a universal solution, but it did not need to be. It needed to work in that moment, on that road, against that tank. And it did. That was enough. In war, enough is everything. The wire still exists in a way. Not the physical wire. That rusted away decades ago or was salvaged after the battle. But the idea of the wire persists. It persists in the training of combat engineers who are taught to think beyond the manual. It persists in the doctrine of asymmetric warfare. It persists in the stories told by veterans to their children and grandchildren. It persists as a reminder that wars are not won only by the strongest or the best equipped, but by the most adaptable. James Hendrix died in 1987. He was 76 years old. His obituary in the Terre Haute newspaper mentioned his service in World War II. Tut. It mentioned his 40 years with the power company. It mentioned his family. It did not mention the Tiger tank. But somewhere in the archives, in the fading pages of an after-action report filed by a nameless officer in December 1944, the story is preserved. The story of a young corporal who saw a problem, thought of a solution, and acted without hesitation. The story of a wire that stopped a tank. The story of why America won, because in the end, that is what the wire represents. Not just a tactic, not just a clever trick, but a philosophy. The philosophy that says no problem is unsolvable, that says no enemy is unbeatable, that says the tools you need are often already in your hands if you are willing to see them, that says the greatest weapon is not the one that fires the biggest shell, but the mind that can imagine a different way to fight. The Tiger tank was a monster of steel, but steel can be broken, wire can stop it, and a man with the courage to try can change the outcome of a battle. That is the truth Hendrix proved in the snow. That is the truth that echoes down through the decades. That is the truth that won the war. And that is how an American soldier, armed with nothing but a spool of wire and a quick mind, stopped one of the most feared tanks in World War II. If you want to hear more incredible stories of American heroes and untold moments from World War II, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.